My name is Lauren Mercer. I'm 32 years old. And the night my mother told me to get out and never come back was the night I finally stopped trying to earn love from people who only respected obedience. She didn't whisper it and she didn't say it. In a moment she could later pretend I had misunderstood. She screamed it across the dining room loud enough to make the whole house feel like it had been waiting for this exact explosion. For a second, nobody moved. I remember staring at her, then at my father standing near the table with that same helpless expression he had worn my entire life whenever things got ugly. He looked like he wanted peace, but never enough to actually protect me. And something inside me just went still. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't ask her to calm down. I just turned around, walked upstairs, packed my overnight bag, and came back down while she kept calling me selfish, dramatic, and ungrateful. When I reached the front door, my father finally found his voice. But all he said was that she didn't mean it. That was the problem. She always meant it in the moment, and everyone expected me to survive it quietly afterward. So, I left. I got in my car and drove away from the house where I had spent years being useful, careful, generous, and never quite good enough. 2 weeks later, my father called me with a question that made everything crack open. He wanted to know why the mortgage hadn't been paid. And when the calls started after that, they didn't stop. By the time I finally answered, I wasn't coming back to save anyone. Before I tell you what he said and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now? And where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. My mother's name is Diane, and if you had only known her through Instagram, you would have thought she had built the perfect life. She posted polished brunch tables, seasonal wreaths, linen napkins folded into impossible shapes, captions about gratitude, family, grace, and home. She called herself a homemaker and lifestyle creator, and people in Neepville actually followed her for decorating tips and holiday hosting ideas. What they didn't see was the version of Diane that lived off camera. The one who compared me to my older brother when I was 12, criticized my body when I was 14, mocked my career choices when I was 17, and somehow managed to make every achievement I earned feel slightly embarrassing. My father, Michael, had spent decades in logistics management, practical and hard work, the kind of man who used to make a room feel steady just by standing in it. But after a company restructuring wiped out his job, something in him collapsed. He found contract work here and there, but not enough, not consistently, and definitely not enough to support the life my mother refused to scale down. Their mortgage in Neepville was $2,800 a month. Their property taxes were brutal. The house looked impressive from the outside, but inside it had become a stage set held up by denial. I found out how bad things were by accident one night when I stopped by and caught my father staring at a stack of overdue notices with a bottle of bourbon open next to him. He tried to laugh it off, then admitted they were drowning. Not theoretically, not tight for a while. Drowning. So, I did what I had been trained to do my whole life. I fixed it quietly. I set up the mortgage payments from one of my accounts, but I ran the transfers in a way that wouldn't trigger questions if my mother saw incoming money. I labeled some of it as consulting reimbursements, moved part of it through a side advisory account, and made sure the mortgage cleared like clockwork. My father knew I was helping, but not how much. My mother didn't know at all. I told myself secrecy was the only way it would work. Because if Diane knew I was the one keeping that house afloat, she would make it about humiliation instead of survival. And the truth is, I wasn't just paying their mortgage. I was paying for the illusion that our family was still functioning. I postponed buying my own condo. I can-led the solo Europe trip I had been planning for 2 years. I told friends I was being financially conservative when really I was pouring my future into a house where I was still treated like an intruder. Meanwhile, my mother kept posting photos of Shutoiri boards and captioning them with things like hard seasons teach elegant resilience, as if resilience were a filter and not a daughter quietly bleeding money into the background. I thought I was keeping the family from collapsing. Looking back, I was only buying time for a bigger explosion. The last few months before everything blew up felt like watching a storm build through 3 separate weekends, each one worse than the one before. The first weekend, I brought over groceries and a thoughtful housewarming style basket for spring because my mother had once mentioned wanting to refresh the kitchen. She smiled for a photo, posted the basket to her story with a caption about sweet family gestures. B then turned around and asked why I always chose colors that made the house look cold. The second weekend, she invited me to brunch with two of her friends and spent half the meal talking about how exhausting modern women were. Always chasing careers, always delaying marriage, always acting like independence was something to brag about. She tagged me in a photo afterward with the caption, "Our ambitious girl made time for family today." And one of her friends commented, "Maybe she'll slow down enough to settle down soon." My mother liked the comment. The third weekend was the one that really lodged itself under my skin. I stopped by unannounced with pastries and heard her in the sunroom talking to one of her church friends on speaker. She said I acted generous because successful women were lonely and lonely women always needed an audience for their money. She laughed and added that if I really loved my parents, I'd stop spending on myself and start sending more home because daughters had responsibilities, not just opinions. I stood there listening while my father said nothing again. That was the part that ate at me more than her cruelty sometimes. His silence, his constant surrender dressed up as peacekeeping. When I told my best friend Rachel everything, including the mortgage payments, she looked at me like she was trying to decide whether to hug me or shake me. "Lauren," she said, "your mother is using guilt like a vampire uses teeth. She doesn't just want help, she wants power. And your dad keeps offering your neck because it's easier than growing a spine." It was harsher than I wanted to hear, which is probably why it was true. I remember laughing, then crying, then laughing again because I was so exhausted by my own excuses. Rachel asked me what exactly I was protecting. Their comfort, their reputation, my fantasy that if I loved them hard enough, they'd become different people. I didn't answer because I didn't have one that made sense. Still, when my father's 61st birthday came around, I went. Of course, I went. I told myself it was for him. I told myself I could get through one weekend. I told myself maybe if I made it special enough, maybe if I came in generous and calm and useful, the tension would stay manageable. That illusion lasted until dinner. I arrived with two gifts for my father. A premium set of golf clubs he'd been eyeing for months and a surprise family weekend voucher for a lakeside resort in Wisconsin. Something quiet and beautiful where I naively imagined we might remember how to act like people who cared about one another. The moment my father opened the clubs, his face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. It was genuine, almost boyish. For one fragile second, it felt worth it. Then my mother took the room back. She gave this thin little laugh and said loud enough for everyone at the table to hear, "Well, that's certainly excessive. Lauren does love making people feel small with expensive gifts." She pulled out her phone, snapped a photo of the golf clubs in my father's lap, and posted it before I could process what she was doing. The caption read, "When your daughter thinks money can substitute for taste." People started liking it while we were still sitting there. My father saw it and said nothing. I wish I could tell you that I handled it elegantly, but I didn't. I stood up and went into the kitchen to breathe. A minute later, I heard my mother in the hallway telling my father that I was dramatic and that I always made his milestones about myself. Something in me turned cold. I walked back into the dining room and said, "You know what's amazing? You can insult me with my own gifts in the room. And I still came here trying to help." My mother folded her arms and asked, "Help with what exactly? More expensive nonsense? More subtle little reminders that you think you're better than us?" My father murmured, "Diane, enough." But it had no weight behind it. I said, "I've supported this family more than you know." She stared at me like I'd committed some unforgivable social offense by speaking in a complete sentence. "Supported?" She repeated. "You mean showing up with performative gifts and advice nobody asked for?" "I tried one last time. I really did." I said, "I overheard enough weeks ago to know things are worse than you've admitted. Let me help build a real plan, a budget, a downsizing timeline, something sustainable." That was when she exploded. Not because I was wrong, but because I was right in front of witnesses. She accused me of spying, of humiliating her, of treating my parents like failed clients. My father kept saying my name in that soft warning tone he used when he wanted me to absorb another blow quietly to keep the peace. But I was so tired of peace only meaning my silence. I said, "I'm not humiliating you. Reality is." The room went still. My mother's face actually changed color. "Get out," she said. I thought she might stop there. She didn't. "Get out and never come back." My father whispered, "Diane." But she cut him off so sharply even he flinched. She told me if I thought the family was beneath me, I was free to enjoy my perfect little life without them. I looked at my father, then really looked, waiting for the moment I had been waiting for since childhood. The moment he would say enough, the moment he would choose me over the ease of surrender. It never came. So I nodded, walked upstairs, packed my bag, and came back down. When I reached the front door, my father said almost under his breath, "She doesn't mean it." And I answered. Then she should have learned not to say it. I left. The door shut behind me. And the strangest part was this. I didn't cry until much later. In that exact moment, all I felt was relief. The first thing I felt after I left wasn't heartbreak. It was exhaustion. Not the kind that comes from one bad night or one ugly argument, but the kind that sinks into your bones after years of being the person who absorbs everything so nobody else has to. I drove for almost an hour before I realized I had no idea where I was going. My hands were tight around the steering wheel. My throat burned and my mind kept replaying the same 3 words over and over again. Snorts, never come back. I should have been devastated. And part of me was, but underneath that was something stranger and quieter. Relief. Real terrifying relief. It was the first time in my life that I had actually taken my mother at her word instead of translating her cruelty into something more forgiving just so I could survive it. I parked outside my apartment building and sat there in silence until Rachel called. The second I heard her voice, whatever emotional scaffolding I had been holding up all evening gave way. I told her everything. The dinner, the shouting, my father doing nothing. The way my mother had looked almost satisfied when she said it. Rachel didn't interrupt. She just listened, then told me to unlock my door because she was already on her way. She showed up 20 minutes later with takeout, a bottle of wine, and the kind of calm presence that made it possible to breathe again. I ended up sleeping on my couch with the TV on, and all the lights in the apartment lit. Because some irrational part of me still felt like if the room got too dark, I'd hear my mother's voice again. But I slept. Really slept. And when I woke up the next morning, the world hadn't ended. No emergency, no dramatic reconciliation, no revelation that she hadn't meant it. Just a quiet apartment and the sudden unfamiliar feeling that maybe I didn't have to live braced for impact anymore. The first few days were messy in practical ways. My father called 3 times the next morning and twice more that afternoon. I let every call go to voicemail. His messages were exactly what I should have expected. Soft, careful, conflict avoiding. Call me when you can. Your mother was upset. Maybe we should all calm down and talk later. There was no apology, no anger either, just the same lifelong expectation that I would return once the emotional weather had shifted enough for everyone else to feel comfortable again. My mother never called at all. That hurt more than I expected. Some part of me had still imagined she might wake up the next day ashamed or at least rattled. But silence from her told me what I probably already knew. Snorts, in her mind, I had left. Therefore, I was the one who had caused the break. By Monday, I went back to work, and it was surreal how normal everything looked. My inbox was full. My meeting still happened. People still asked for updates and forecasts and presentations. I sat in a conference room making strategic recommendations while part of me still felt like I was standing in my parents' dining room being told to get out. But something strange happened by Tuesday afternoon. I noticed I wasn't flinching every time my phone lit up. By Wednesday night, I realized I had eaten dinner without that knot in my stomach I always carried after visiting my parents. By Friday, I slept through the night again. Then again on Saturday. It scared me a little how quickly my body responded to distance, as if it had been waiting years for permission to stop surviving. That same week, I went into my banking app and stared at the automatic mortgage transfer for a full 10 minutes before I touched it. $2,800 scheduled like clockwork. I had set it up 3 years earlier and barely allowed myself to think about what it really meant. I just told myself I was helping family, protecting stability, buying time. But standing there in my kitchen looking at that transfer while my mother's words still echoed in my head, I finally saw it clearly. I wasn't preserving family. I was financing dysfunction. I was paying for appearances, denial, and a house that had become more important than the people inside it. I turned the automatic payment off. Then I sat down at my table and cried harder than I had cried the night I left, because that click felt final in a way walking out hadn't. Walking out was emotional. This was structural. This was me removing myself from the machine that had kept their illusion alive. I half expected to feel immediate guilt, but what came first was fear, followed by a thin thread of freedom. For the first time in years, I knew exactly what my own monthly budget looked like without that silent sacrifice stitched into it. That weekend, instead of spiraling, I booked a therapy consultation. Then I did something even more radical. I started looking at condos. Not just casually, not just maybe next year, but seriously. The kind with tall windows and actual light. The kind where nobody could weaponize the phrase "my house" against me. The kind where every object inside would belong to my life, not my performance as a daughter. 2 weeks after I left, I put an offer on a condo near downtown Chicago. It wasn't huge, but it was beautiful in a way that felt honest rather than showy. Hardwood floors, a narrow balcony, a kitchen with brushed brass handles, enough room for a real dining table, and a reading chair by the window. I walked through it once and immediately started imagining all the choices my mother would hate. The deep green accent wall in the living room. Open shelves instead of upper cabinets. Abstract art instead of framed family photos. A rust-cold sofa instead of anything beige and safe. For years, even my private taste had been shaped by anticipated criticism. Suddenly, I was choosing things with no one's voice in my ear but my own. Around that same time, my manager pulled me aside and told me I was being seriously considered for a promotion I had been working toward for nearly a year. I remember staring at him for a second, almost confused, because I was so used to major life moments getting emotionally contaminated by my family that I didn't know what it felt like to receive good news in peace. I celebrated by taking myself to dinner alone. I ordered exactly what I wanted, stayed as long as I wanted, and walked home through the city lights with the bizarre sensation that my own life was finally coming into focus. I also started therapy that week. On my second session, my therapist asked me what I felt when I thought about not helping my parents anymore. I said, "Guilt, obviously." She nodded and asked, "Under the guilt, what else?" I sat there for a long time before answering. "Anger," I said, "and under that resentment. And under that, I think grief." Because that was the truth. I wasn't just grieving the latest fight. I was grieving the version of my family I had been trying to earn since childhood, the one that only ever existed in flashes and fantasies. As the days passed, the silence from my parents stopped feeling like suspense and started feeling like evidence. My father didn't want to confront reality until reality forced him to. My mother believed emotion could override math as long as she was loud enough. I kept picturing them in that house, moving through rooms I had quietly paid to preserve, still probably talking about me as if I were the difficult one. That thought should have sent me running back into fixer mode. Instead, it hardened something healthy in me. I started decorating the condo before the paperwork had even fully closed. I bought paint swatches. I ordered a lamp I absolutely did not need. I made lists of what I wanted my new place to feel like. Warm, quiet, safe, mine. Rachel came over one evening with pizza and laughed when she saw the samples spread across my coffee table. "Look at you," she said. "Building a life instead of underwriting theirs." I laughed, too. But later that night, I wrote the sentence down because it was exactly what I was doing. And maybe that was the real shift. I wasn't just escaping something. I was choosing something. My own space, my own finances, my own nervous system, my own future. Then the silence ended, not gradually, violently. My phone started buzzing on a Tuesday morning during a client review. First, my father, then again, then again. By lunch, there were 17 missed calls. By dinner, 32. The texts started after that. "Call me. It's urgent. Please answer. We need to talk right now." Then my mother joined in, which told me immediately that this wasn't emotional outreach. This was financial panic. By the second day, I had 115 missed calls between them. 115 calls in less than 48 hours. One voicemail from my mother said, "Do you want us to lose everything?" Another said, "How could you do this to your own family?" Not one message asked if I was okay. Not one asked whether they had gone too far. Not one acknowledged the night she threw me out. That was when I knew with absolute clarity that nothing about their urgency was love. It was consequence. I stood alone in the middle of my half-furnished condo, looked at my phone lighting up again on the counter, and understood that the version of me who would have answered on the first ring no longer existed. The phone kept vibrating. I let it. And when I finally decided to pick up, it wasn't to rescue them. It was to end something for good. I let the phone ring through call number 115 before I answered. It was a Thursday evening. I was barefoot in my half-unpacked condo and the sun was dropping behind the buildings in a way that made the whole room look bronze. I put the call on speaker and said, "What?" My father exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for 2 days. "Lauren, thank God. Why did you stop paying the mortgage?" No greeting, no apology, not even a pause to pretend he'd called because he loved me. Just the question, the exact question from the hook of this whole disaster. I actually laughed once, short and sharp, because hearing him finally say it out loud made everything uglier and simpler at the same time. "So, you know, now," I said. Snorts. He stammered something about the bank notice, late fees, confusion, how he thought there had been a mistake. Then my mother's voice cut in from somewhere near him, loud and furious. "Don't speak to her like she's doing us a favor. Ask her what kind of daughter sabotages her own parents over one argument." I leaned against my kitchen counter and closed my eyes. "One argument." I repeated. "That's what you think this is." My father tried to hush her. She kept going. She said I was punishing them, being vindictive, acting like a martyr because I had helped a little. That word did it. A little. I opened a note on my phone where I had written down every payment after the 50th one because somewhere inside me, I think I always knew I'd need the receipts. If not for them, then for myself. "No," I said calm enough that my own voice surprised me. "Let's do this correctly. I paid your mortgage for 3 years, $2,800 a month. That's $100,800. I delayed buying my own place. I cancelled trips. I rearranged my life so you could keep living in a house you refused to admit you couldn't afford. And during that same period, Mom mocked my job, used my gifts for social media bait, called me selfish, and told me to get out and never come back. So, no, I did not sabotage you. I stopped rescuing you." Silence. Real silence this time. Then my father very quietly said, "Lauren, I didn't know it was that much." I answered, "Because not knowing was easier for you." My mother came back harder, but I could hear the crack in it now. "We are your family. Family doesn't mean I finance your denial while you humiliate me." I said family doesn't mean I let you use guilt as a payment system. She called me cruel. I told her cruel was accepting my money while treating me like contamination. She said they could lose the house. I said they should have thought of that before valuing appearances over reality. She said, "What are we supposed to do now?" And there it was, the first honest question she had asked in years. "Sell it," I said. "Downsize, work, budget, live like people who understand arithmetic. Do what every other adult has to do when their choices catch up to them." My father started crying then, not loud. Just that exhausted, broken kind of crying men do when they've been lying to themselves so long they can't hold the structure up anymore. He said he was sorry. He, Snorts, said he should have told me the truth. He said he should have stopped her. And I believed he meant it. But meaning it late doesn't erase the damage. My mother's voice changed next. It went from steel to panic. She said, "Len, please don't do this. We can talk. We can work something out. You don't understand what people will say if this gets out." That line almost made me smile. Even then, with foreclosure breathing down her neck, she was still worried about the audience. "I do understand," I said. "I understand perfectly. You're not sorry because I'm hurt. You're sorry because the consequences are public. She started pleading, then fast and messy, saying I couldn't just abandon them, that she had sacrificed her life for this family, that mothers say things in anger, that daughters are supposed to forgive. I let her talk until I had absolutely no feeling left around the edges of it. Snorts. Then I said the one thing I had been building toward for years without realizing it. No, I'm done. I will not save you again. I will not come back so you can use me and resent me at the same time. I am not your emergency fund. I am not your emotional landfill. And I am not the child you get to wound and then summon when the bills arrive. My father whispered my name. My mother started crying in earnest. And I hung up just like that. Clean. Final. No dramatic speech after, no shaking collapse, no second guessing. I set the phone down on the counter and stood in my own kitchen while the room went quiet again. Have you ever imagined saying no after years of being trained to say yes and felt how terrifying and powerful that silence can be? Because in that moment, silence finally belonged to me. Consequences moved faster than apologies. Within 6 weeks, my parents' perfect home had gone from aspirational Instagram backdrop to a very real financial problem. My mother's follower count started dropping the minute the illusion cracked. She had built an audience on curated abundance, polished hosting, and the smug tone of a woman who thought good taste was proof of good character. But once she stopped posting from the big kitchen and manicured backyard, once vague captions about storms replaced pictures of perfection, people noticed. A few local women who knew enough of the truth started leaving pointed comments. Brands stopped responding. The account that had once hovered around 28,000 followers slid under 8,000 by the end of the season. The house went up for sale under pressure. And because they were late, desperate, and carrying debt, they sold it below what my mother had bragged for years it was worth. Watching that happen from a distance felt less like revenge than like gravity finally being allowed to work. My father took a mid-level logistics coordinator job with a regional supply company. My mother, after insisting for years that retail was soul-killing work for people who lacked ambition, ended up taking a full-time floor supervisor position at Macy's in Oakbrook because it was one of the only places that would hire her quickly. She spent 8 hours a day managing fitting room chaos, weekend returns, inventory complaints, and customers who never once cared how beautiful her tablescapes had looked online. She also started therapy after a doctor told her the panic attacks and chest pressures she'd been having were stress-induced anxiety, not just exhaustion. My father texted me first, then emailed, then finally wrote one honest message. We are selling. I know I have no right to ask, but could you help us make a plan so we don't destroy what little is left? I thought about ignoring it. I really did. But I had promised myself I would stop confusing boundaries with vengeance. So I agreed to help once and once only. We met at a public library conference room. Not their house, not mine. I brought spreadsheets, debt projections, downsizing options, and a retirement survival model based on what they could actually sustain. My mother looked older, smaller, stripped of performance. My father looked ashamed. I told them I would help create the plan, but I would not contribute another dollar. Not one. If they wanted a relationship with me, it would exist separately from money, guilt, and control. My mother cried quietly through most of that meeting. My father listened and took notes. For the first time in my life, they were both forced to face me as an adult they could not command. They ended up in a townhouse less than half the size of the old house, functional, modest, real. 6 months after I walked out, I stood in my condo at sunset, wise looking toward Lake Michigan with a cup of coffee in my hand and a room full of furniture chosen without fear. My promotion had come through. My sleep was normal. My chest didn't tighten every Sunday. My mother still texted carefully before calling. My father apologized more directly now, though I had learned that remorse and repair were not the same thing. Some days I missed the fantasy of the family I wanted. But I did not miss the version of love that required my silence, my money, and my self-erasure. That version could stay buried. The truth I finally learned was simple and expensive. Sometimes cutting people off from your rescue is the only way they ever meet reality. And sometimes reality is the most merciful thing left. So tell me what you think. Should you keep sacrificing yourself for a toxic family just because they're family? Or is setting a boundary the most honest form of love? Comment below with your story. I read every comment. Thank you for watching until the final moment. This story is completely fictional and made only for entertainment, education, and reflective storytelling. We hope it reminds you that the people who abandon you, underestimated you, or they miss your efforts do not get to return later and claim the sessions you build without them.